Well, one thing we mustn't forget is that Donald Trump was actually elected on this was one of his main manifesto points, that he was going to put up tariffs. So you can't blame Trump for doing this, really, unless you're not interested in the whole idea of democracy, when whether it works or not is one thing or another. But this is what he said he'd do, and he's now doing it. But the root of the problem is the United States is not competitive anymore. It's certainly not as it used to be. It's not an economic powerhouse. What we've seen really is a complete slide in the economic wealth, the wealth of individuals, and the general economic power of the US, the whole country. That is to say, individuals' spare money they've got in their pocket, etc., purchasing power, and the corporate success. The ability of the banks to fund good ideas is down and down. And that's really been happening ever since 1971, when the President Nixon took the US off the gold standard, the dollar off the gold standard. It's been slowly sinking ever since. And these are desperate measures, really, because what's happened is China is now beaten the US at capitalism. Even though, of course, it's a nominally communist country, they're actually more successful economically, much more, than the US is. So the US is scrabbling around, really, to try and say, well, we're just going to stop imports, and that will allow our domestic economy to start to pick up. But, of course, as the other guest just pointed out, this is at the expense of all prices starting to go up. Okay, so this meeting, the G20 is taking place tomorrow and Saturday in Osaka. It's the first time G20's happened in Japan, apparently, according to their website. And the only sort of diplomacy that seems to happen these days with Trump is threats. Isn't this partly the book he wrote, The Art of the Deal, where you threaten and that enables you to maybe get a better deal at the table? Well, this might work in the boardrooms and in business negotiations, but when it comes to international relations, this is simply not diplomatic language. And especially when you're talking about two massive nuclear superpowers like China and the US, Trump shouldn't really be in this situation. The guy's a businessman. He might be very good at cutting business deals, but when it comes to international trade, international economic warfare, which we're seeing at the moment, for example, against Iran and other countries, and Venezuela, for example, these are acts of war, these sanctions and the effective economic blockades. He's creeping towards that sort of language with China. And I'm afraid that art of the deal is going to backfire right in Trump's face if he carries on like this.
And now, Professor Erasmus, Tony has a point there. The U.S. voters voted exactly on this platform that is going to go after China, but I think a lot of them were somewhat misled. They kind of got bamboozled. They felt like they're bringing jobs back from China, not having their basically all the commodities that they use on a daily basis go up. Especially, a lot of them are rural, and laborers.
Yes, well, the jobs have not come back. In fact, now as the U.S. economy begins in recent couple months, softened significantly all across the board, both in the job numbers, both in business investment has turned negative, consumption's less than 1%, manufacturing is flat. The U.S. economy is now falling into the slowing global economy. The jobs aren't coming back. The jobs are going to even disappear because the business cycle has turned. You got to remember this economic nationalism theme in which he got elected was really designed to blame the foreigners, whether it's foreign capital or foreign countries or immigrants trying to come into the U.S. That's the core theme that he's been using in order to whip up his base and push through some of his policies. You got to understand that there's a slowing global economy, and it's not driven just by the trade war. It was there before, and it's getting worse. And the U.S. now is and it's not just Trump. It's the elites in the U.S., a significant part of the elites in the U.S. want to restructure the global relationships, the trade relationships, the money flow relationships, and so forth, as they prepare for the next decade to ensure the continuation of U.S. hegemony globally, economically, and, of course, then politically and militarily as well. But this is all about, rearranging relationships to restore U.S. capital and the U.S. leadership. I would not underestimate U.S. economic power. Still, yes, in some ways it's been weakening, but in other ways it's still quite formidable. Still 85% of all trade is done in dollars. And when the U.S. turns the dollar screw, as in the case of Venezuela, you see what happens. They've wrecked that economy purposely in Venezuela. Domestically, there's a restructuring of neoliberalism also going on. The Trump tax cuts are an example of that. Fiscal policy, here's a tax on the central bank, monetary policy. This is all about the U.S. elites looking to the next decade and trying to restructure to remain, hegemonic. And China's a key element in that restructuring because a lot of U.S. companies have moved their supply chains over to China. And the next decade is going to be a fight over next generation technologies. I'm talking about cybersecurity, 5G, artificial intelligence. These are the next industries of the future. They are also the core for the next military dominance over the next decade. That's why at the core of the U.S. trade fight with China is really technology. It's really a fight over technology. It's not a fight over trade deficits, what the Chinese have already conceded on. It's not a fight anymore over access to the China market. They've conceded on that. It's the U.S. hardliners, the neocons, demanding technological capitulation from the Chinese, and the Chinese won't do that right now. The hardliners, the Lighthouses, the Boltons, they don't want a deal with China. They want this thing to continue, and they're going to cut China out of the U.S. market, and they're going to try to force U.S. companies' supply chains to restructure and come back to the U.S. or elsewhere. This is a war over an economic trade war that's really over next-generation technologies, and that's why it's so difficult to get a resolution to this, I think.
And Professor, if that happens, Americans will be paying about 100, 110 grand for an F-150 Ford pickup. But let me go back to Tony. Tony, I'm going to let you go ahead and get the last word in there, but we've got a couple minutes left.
This whole business of the military is really important as a backdrop to all of this. So we've got so many military bases the US has got around the world, but particularly around China and around Russia, surrounding these countries, places like Guam. Okay, so that's a bit of a distance away, but have we got Chinese bases off the California coast? Have we got Chinese bases in the Caribbean? No. So the Chinese have been quite restrained in a military way. Anyone would think, well, if the US is going to put a base right next to China, then the Chinese are going to put one next to, but they haven't. They've been quite restrained around the world. There's only a very few major Chinese bases outside China itself. So the Chinese have been very, I think, disciplined and restrained. They're not playing the American game of trying to play the bullies of the world. Their defense spending isn't anywhere near as much as the United States. And this is one of the reasons, of course, why the US is in this economic nightmare, is because of the absolute obsession with this massive military spending every single year. And look, when it comes to the G20, there is another organisation I would suggest your viewers have a look at, if they haven't already. It's called the G20 Finance Group in Washington, D.C., and these are the people who control most of the money in the Western world. We're talking about the central bankers, some of the top finance people, and the G30 Finance Group are total zero transparency. So they are trying to manage single-handedly the global economy. They're trying to get people to do exactly what they want, and there's no transparency whatsoever. There's no accountability for these people. And this is why we're starting to look now at capitalism turning into some kind of feudal system. Right from the very top, the people that own and control most of the money are just simply using everyone else as their serfs. They'll give a little bit of money or lend it to the people that they like, their own friends. And they're not necessarily, okay, so there is some venture capitalists as well. But this model of finance is doomed to fail. I mean, the Chinese at some point could quite easily dump the US government debt. It's like 1.2 trillion they've got of that. And many people say they won't do that because that would damage the global economy. Well, the global economy is being damaged anyway. what would happen if the Chinese dumped the US government debt they've got, and they're the biggest holder outside the US, is US bond prices would slump. They'd be more expensive for the US businesses to borrow money, and the US economic slump would really kick in then. So the Chinese have always got this up their sleeve to use. So the Americans, and particularly Trump, may not even understand these deep economics, but the Chinese certainly do, and they know that they've got that economic nuclear button they can press any time they want. So money needs to be the servant of humanity, not the master. And the way it's going with the G20 and with the Western economic system, money is becoming far too dominant, and we've got far too many people with not enough money even to make ends meet. So these G30 finance group, the G20 as well, the banks need to be reined in right now. Otherwise, we're cruising for a bruising, as they say, with an economic crash of some sort in the not too distant future.
Gentlemen, we're all out of time. I want to thank you both for joining us. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol, and Jack Rasmus, professor of political economy at St. Mary's College, joining us out of San Francisco, California. Thank you both. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment and for this bulletin here on Press TV. Thanks for joining us, and bye-bye for now.